Before we dive into this intense and emotional story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any episodes. And at the end, let me know in the comments. Do you believe that people can change? Now, let's get to the story. The sound of hurried heels echoed through the white hallways of the hospital. Sofia held the clipboard tightly, taking deep breaths to maintain her composure. It was her first month as a nurse, and that day had been particularly tough. Patients coming and going, emergencies popping up left and right. But nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen. She entered the examination room, and as soon as she lifted her gaze, a shiver ran down her spine. Sitting on the examination table, with a bored and impatient expression, was Edward Johnson. He wasn't just any patient. He was the most powerful man in town, owner of one of the largest corporations in the country. His reputation preceded him. Ruthless in business, cold, and known for treating people like disposable objects. Finally, his voice sliced through the silence like a sharp blade. I scheduled this exam over an hour ago. Is this a hospital or a circus? Sofia swallowed hard, maintaining her calm. I apologize for the wait, Mr. Johnson. There was an emergency and... Your problem, he interrupted, rolling his eyes as he adjusted his impeccable suit. Let's get this over with. She nodded and moved closer to check his vital signs. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she focused on the task. Could you extend your arm, please? She asked, keeping her voice professional. Edward sighed dramatically and did as she asked, as if he were doing her a favor. Sofia put the cuff around his arm to check his blood pressure. But midway through the process, her fingers slipped, and the cuff came undone. A simple mistake, fixable in seconds, but not for him. You have to be kidding me. He yanked his arm away, his expression turning to pure contempt. Is this a real hospital, or did they hire some random person off the street? Sofia felt her face burn with humiliation. The other nurses and a nearby doctor stopped what they were doing and threw curious glances her way. Her heart raced. I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson. I'll redo the procedure. You're not redoing anything. He stood up, glaring down at her. I don't tolerate incompetence. What's your name? She hesitated. Sofia. Great, Sofia. Now you can grab your things and leave. I'll make sure you never step foot in this hospital again. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Dr. Smith? Yeah, I'm here at your private clinic, and I just got attended by a completely incapable nurse. Yes, I want her fired now. The floor seemed to vanish beneath her. She looked around, but no one dared intervene. Her boss appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, avoiding making direct eye contact with her. Sofia, please follow me. Her eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. With shaky steps, she followed him to the administration office, where she heard the worst news of her life. She was fired. No explanation, no second chances. As she left the hospital that night, the cold wind cut through her skin. Her dream of becoming a great nurse had been destroyed by one man, and in that moment, she promised herself never again would she allow someone like Edward Johnson to humiliate her. Never again. But life has a way of surprising you. The following months were tough. Sofia applied for jobs at various hospitals, but her sudden dismissal and lack of explanation made any new opportunity nearly impossible. The skeptical looks from recruiters, the evasive answers, everything pointed to the shadow of Edward Johnson looming over her future. Desperate, she took on smaller jobs. She cared for elderly people in private homes, worked in small clinics, and slowly began to rebuild her reputation. But the scar from that humiliation never faded. She swore she would never again let anyone treat her that way. If she had been insecure before, afraid of making mistakes, now it was different. She would become the best, stand out in such a way that no one would ever dare question her competence again. Years went by. Sofia hardened. She became an impeccable professional, but also someone who avoided any emotional ties with her patients. Her only focus was the work, and then fate took an unexpected turn. Edward Johnson, the man who had destroyed her dream, was in a severe car accident. His life hung by a thread. His recovery would be long and painful. He would need daily care, someone to help him regain movement. And ironically, the world turned in such a way that the best professional for this job was Sofia. Years later, Sofia and Edward would meet again. But this time, he would be completely vulnerable and in her hands. Sofia looked at the new patient's file with an unreadable expression. Her gaze scanned every detail of the medical report, trying to absorb the information without letting emotions interfere. Name: Edward Johnson. Age: 38. Condition: post-op. After a serious accident. Prognosis: would need months of intensive physiotherapy to regain movement in his legs. The initial shock quickly gave way to a mix of conflicting feelings. It was him. The man who, years ago, destroyed her career with a phone call and words of contempt. And now, ironically, his recovery was in her hands. Sofia took a deep breath, trying to push the weight of the past aside. Professionalism. That was the key. She had fought too hard to let grudges take over. But deep down, she couldn't deny it. Fate had a twisted sense of humor. With the clipboard firmly in hand, she walked to the patient's private room. The luxury hospital exuded sophistication, with its glass walls and minimalist furniture. She pushed the door open slowly, and there he was. Edward lay in the bed, visibly drained. His once imposing face now showed signs of exhaustion and pain. His clenched jaw, half-closed eyes, and a look of restrained agony. There was something deeply ironic about the scene. The man who once exuded arrogance was now reduced to a vulnerable, dependent figure. He lifted his gaze as he heard the door open. At first, he seemed like just another patient analyzing the nurse who entered. But then, his eyes narrowed. The realization hit. "You..." His voice came out hoarse, incredulous. Sofia kept her face impassive, walking over to the bed. "Good afternoon, Mr. Johnson. I'll be your nurse in charge of your rehabilitation." Her voice was professional, but there was a slight coldness to it. "We'll be working together over the next few months." Edward tried to move, but a spasm of pain made him groan involuntarily. He breathed deeply, furrowing his brow. Is this some kind of joke? His tone was a mix of shock and irritation. "You... here? I take my job seriously. And you need care. It's that simple." Sofia extended the clipboard. "We need to discuss your physiotherapy routine and adjustments to your medication." He let out a dry laugh, though his eyes were filled with frustration. This can't be a coincidence. Sofia remained calm. "Fate has funny ways of working, don't you think? Now, if you could cooperate, I can start helping you." Edward stared at her for a long moment. There was something different about him. The arrogant glint was no longer as intense, replaced by an exhaustion that went beyond physical pain. But his pride was still there. "I don't need your help. I have enough resources to hire anyone I want." Sofia crossed her arms. "But I'm the one here, and I'm the best in my field. Or do you want to stay in that bed longer than necessary?" He clenched his teeth, looking away. He was a man used to being in control, giving orders. Accepting help from someone he had once despised was a blow to his ego. But the truth was undeniable. He needed her. "How long until I can walk again?" he asked, trying to sound cold. Sofia reviewed the reports before answering. "If you follow the treatment properly, maybe 3 months, but it depends on you. If you cooperate, if you make an effort, it could be faster. If not, it could take years." Edward closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing her words. For a man like him, being stuck in a bed was a nightmare. He opened his eyes again, now more resigned. What do I need to do? Sofia saw it as a small victory, but she didn't show it. Today, we'll start with light exercises to prevent muscle atrophy. Then, we'll work on strength and endurance, but I need you to trust me and follow my instructions. Edward let out a heavy sigh. As if I have a choice. Exactly. Sofia gave a small smile, more to herself than to him. Let's begin. The first exercises were challenging. Moving his legs, even minimally, was tormenting for Edward. He gritted his teeth, sweated, tried to hide the pain, but it was clear. He was reaching his limit. Sofia stayed firm by his side, encouraging him but not easing up. One more time. She held his ankle, guiding the movement. I already said, that's enough. He breathed deeply, closing his eyes. No, you can do more, let's go. Her voice was firm, unshakable. Edward opened his eyes and stared at her. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. It was a look filled with history, with resentment, with something neither of them could name. But then he breathed deeply and tried again. When the session ended, Edward was exhausted. But he had done more than he had expected. It wasn't so bad after all. He murmured, leaning back in the bed. Sofia smiled to herself. That's just the beginning. She closed her clipboard. Tomorrow, same time. I expect you to be ready. She turned to leave, but just before she crossed the door, she heard his voice again. Sofia. He hesitated. When she turned, she saw something rare, a glimpse of vulnerability in his eyes. Why did you take this job? After everything. She held his gaze, keeping her expression neutral. Because I'm a professional. And because, like it or not, you need me. And then, without waiting for a response, she left the room, leaving Edward alone with his thoughts. The tables had turned, but was Edward ready to deal with it? And Sofia? Could she maintain her professional coldness, or would old wounds start to resurface? The morning sun shyly filtered through the curtains in Edward's room. He woke up feeling a throbbing pain in his legs. The previous day had been a test of endurance, and the very thought of going through it all again was unbearable. He hated feeling weak, and hated even more depending on someone, especially her. When the door opened, there was Sofia, flawless, in her white uniform. Her eyes quickly scanned his posture, the expression on his face, the signs of muscle tension. Even without asking, she knew he was in pain. But she didn't offer any words of comfort. How are you feeling? She asked as she checked his file. Edward let out a sarcastic laugh. Like someone who's been run over by a truck, but I guess you already know that. She simply nodded, not showing any reaction. Great, then we can start today's session. He scoffed, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to muster patience. Were you always this cold? Or is this personal? His voice had a challenging tone. Sofia raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. Cold? I'd say professional, but if that bothers you, I can ask another nurse to take over your case. Edward clenched his jaw. The truth was, he didn't want another nurse. As much as he hated to admit it, there was something about Sofia that made him feel challenged. And, in a way, it kept him motivated. No. His response came quickly. You've started. Now finish. Sofia restrained a satisfied smile. She knew that Edward would never admit it, but her presence affected him, in a way that even he didn't understand. Then stop complaining and let's get started. She moved closer to the bed and began adjusting his position. Touching him was inevitable, but each movement was technical, meticulous. Still, Edward felt an involuntary shiver as he felt her. Steady hands guiding his stiff muscles. It was strange. He was used to being in control, to being feared and respected. But now, he was at her mercy. The exercises began. First, small flexes, then controlled movement of his leg muscles. Each repetition was torture for Edward, but he refused to show weakness. "Is this all you've got, Mr. Johnson?" Her voice carried a slight hint of provocation. "I thought you were stronger than this." He narrowed his eyes, feeling his pride wounded. "Do you want me to break my leg again?" He breathed deeply, forcing himself to continue. "I want you to try harder. The sooner you accept that you need help, the sooner you'll get out of this bed." Edward watched her for a moment. There was something different about Sofia. Before, she seemed hesitant, insecure. Now she carried a confident, unshakable posture. He wondered what had happened in the last few years to transform her like this. "And you?" He spoke, interrupting the exercises. "You've changed a lot since the last time we saw each other." Sofia remained expressionless. "Time does that to people? Or maybe the humiliation I put you through shaped you?" He tested her, wanting to see how far he could provoke her. But Sofia didn't bite. She simply smiled enigmatically. "Maybe it did. But if that's what made me the professional I am today, then I guess I should thank you." Edward didn't expect that response. For a moment, he was left speechless. She was no longer the insecure young woman he had dismissed without a second thought. Now, she was someone who challenged him, someone who didn't bow down to him. The session continued. Each day was a silent battle between them. Edward trying to keep his pride intact, Sofia maintaining her firm and unshakable stance. But both of them knew that this war went far beyond physical exercises. After the workout, Sofia was preparing to leave the room when Edward spoke, not looking at her. "Do you really not hold a grudge? Not even a little?" Sofia stopped at the door, but didn't turn around. "What I do or don't hold doesn't affect my work. See you tomorrow, Mr. Johnson." She left, leaving Edward alone, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure who was in control of that situation. Would this silent war between Sofia and Edward continue, or would something unexpected change everything? The days followed the same rigid routine. Sofia arrived promptly every morning, guided Edward through the painful exercises, and then left without looking back. But something was changing. The silent war between them was beginning to give way to something new, something unsettling. That morning, Sofia entered the room and found Edward more serious than usual. He was holding a book, but his eyes were distant. It wasn't the usual challenging gaze. It was as if he was lost in thought. "Ready for your exercises?" she asked, taking her clipboard. He took a while to answer. "I dreamed about the past last night, about the time when I was different." Edward let out a heavy sigh. "I used to have it all, Sofia, and I wasted it." Sofia paused for a moment, surprised by his sudden honesty, but she quickly resumed her professional demeanor. "And now you have a second chance. If you want it, of course." Edward smiled wryly. "I don't know if I'm someone who deserves second chances." Sofia remained silent for a few moments. Then, she moved closer to the bed and began adjusting the pillows to support him better. Everyone deserves one, but that doesn't mean everyone takes it. Edward's gaze met hers. There was something there, something neither of them wanted to admit. She quickly averted her eyes and started preparing the equipment for the session. But before she could continue, Edward lightly grasped her wrist. Sofia froze. "Thank you." His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "For what you're doing for me." Sofia's heart raced for a second, but she quickly composed herself, pulling away. "I'm just doing my job, Mr. Johnson." Her voice was firm, but her hand still tingled where he had touched her. Edward noticed the way she tried to hide the impact of that brief contact. A barely perceptible smile appeared on his lips. The session began. Edward was more focused than on the previous days. Sofia noticed the difference, but didn't comment. Her role was to encourage him, not inflate his ego. But deep down, she knew something had changed. By the end of the exercise, Edward was exhausted, but determined. "Can we try something more challenging tomorrow?" he asked, surprising Sofia. She stared at him for a moment before replying, "If you keep up this pace, you'll be able to take your first steps soon." The gleam in Edward's eyes revealed his hope, something he hadn't shown in a long time. Sofia gathered her things, ready to leave. But before she crossed the door, Edward called out, "Sofia?" She turned. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Nothing. Just good night." Sofia furrowed her brow, surprised, but instead of responding, she simply nodded and left. On the other side of the door, she leaned against the wall for a moment. Her heart was beating faster than it should. No, she couldn't get involved. This was just a job, nothing more. But something inside her told her she was lying to herself. Sofia could deny it as much as she wanted, but what if her feelings started speaking louder? And Edward? Was he really changing, or was it just another game? The night was long for Edward. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, images from the past haunted him. The man he was, the choices he made, the people he hurt. And amidst it all, Sofia's face appeared. Not the Sofia of today, but the one from years ago. That shy girl who tried to hide her emotions whenever he said something cruel. Now, she was there, by his side, every day. Strong, unshakable. He admired her for that, but at the same time, he felt something unsettling, a tightness in his chest that he didn't understand. When Sofia entered the room that morning, she found a different Edward. His eyes were tired, a beard was beginning to grow on his face, and the expression of arrogance had given way to something darker. "Did you sleep?" she asked, observing him closely. He ran a hand over his face and sighed. "A little. Or at least I tried." Sofia noticed that something was wrong, but she chose not to press the issue. "Let's start today's session." Her voice remained professional. Edward nodded and tried to adjust himself in bed. When she moved closer to help, he briefly held her hand. His touch wasn't firm nor provocative. It was almost a silent plea for help. "Do you believe people can change?" he asked, without looking directly at her. Sofia was taken aback by the question. She slowly pulled her hand away and took a deep breath. "I believe some want to change, but few actually manage." Edward let out a bitter smile. "I want to change. But what if it's too late?" Sofia watched him for a moment. She had asked herself that very question many times. Was he the same person who humiliated her years ago? Or had that man already ceased to exist? You have to decide what you want to be from now on. It doesn't matter what you did before, only what you'll do now. Her voice wasn't comforting, it was a challenge. Edward absorbed those words. Something inside him seemed broken, and he hated the feeling of vulnerability. The physical therapy session began. He was more focused, more determined. Sofia noticed that something inside him was different, but she didn't know if it was a good sign. As she adjusted the position of his legs, Edward looked at her with a different intensity. It wasn't arrogance, not provocation. It was something deeper. "Why are you still here?" he asked suddenly. "What do you mean?" Sofia stopped what she was doing. "Why did you take this job? After everything I've done, why didn't you leave me?" Sofia swallowed hard. That was a question she avoided answering, even to herself. But in that moment, she decided to be honest. "Because I'm not the same person you knew before. I don't carry grudges. I just want to do my job." Edward nodded slowly. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just that. There was something more there, something neither of them wanted to admit. When the session ended, Sofia packed her things and prepared to leave. But before she could go, she turned to him. "Rest a bit. You need to." Her voice, for the first time, didn't sound as distant. Edward just watched her as she left the room. Something inside him was changing, but he still didn't know if it was for the better or for the worse. Edward was in an internal conflict, but could Sofia really maintain her barrier? Or was something about to happen that would change everything? Edward woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in cold sweat. The room was silent, only the distant sound of the city breaking through the darkness. His heart was racing, his chest rising and falling irregularly. It was a nightmare, but not just any nightmare. He had dreamed of the day of the accident. The sound of the crash, the glass shattering, the excruciating pain that consumed his body. And then, the darkness. He tried to control his breathing, but the panic was still there. That's when he heard a soft sound at the door. Sofia. She entered, holding a glass of water. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice a concerned whisper. Edward looked at her, trying to pull himself together. Sofia's steady gaze met his, but there was something different about it that night. Vulnerability. He didn't want to seem weak in front of her, but the truth was that he felt completely shattered. "I couldn't sleep," he confessed, his voice hoarse. Sofia moved closer to the bed and handed him the glass. Edward took it, his fingers brushing hers for a moment. An electric shock ran through his body with the contact. He watched Sofia for a moment, trying to understand why her presence seemed to be the only thing that calmed him. "Nightmares?" she asked, crossing her arms. He nodded, drinking the water slowly. "Yes, the accident. Always the same dream. It feels so real." His voice faltered slightly, and he hated it. Sofia sat in the armchair beside the bed, her posture more relaxed than usual. "It's normal. Your body is still dealing with all of this. But your mind needs time to heal, too." She looked at him with a gaze that seemed to pierce him. "You never talk about what happened." Edward looked away, staring at the glass in his hands. "There's not much to say. I was driving too fast. I thought nothing could stop me. Life proved me wrong." He let out a bitter laugh. Sofia remained silent for a few moments, observing him. She knew he was hiding far more than he was willing to admit. "You're not invincible, Edward. No one is. But what matters now is what you do with this second chance." He looked up at her, and for a moment, the air between them seemed heavier. He didn't know how to describe what he felt, but something was different. There was a contained desire, something forbidden, dangerous. Sofia noticed the tension and quickly stood up, adjusting her clothes. I just wanted to see if you were okay. Try to sleep. Tomorrow will be a new day." She turned to leave, but Edward gently held her wrist. "Stay just a little longer." His voice was almost a plea, something rare coming from him. Sofia froze for a moment. The warmth of his hand on her skin was something she didn't expect to feel, but, against her better judgment, she stayed. And that night, without saying another word, they shared the silence. And for the first time in a long time, Edward didn't fear closing his eyes. Sofia and Edward were growing closer, but would they be able to maintain that delicate line between professionalism and feeling? Leave a comment about what you think will happen next. Like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any chapters. The morning arrived silently, but charged with something new. Sofia felt the weight of what had happened the night before. There were no words, no bold gestures, but the silence between her and Edward had spoken volumes. When she left the room that early morning, her heart was racing in a way it shouldn't have been. She tried to push the thoughts away and focused on her work. At the end of the day, all that mattered was doing her job well and keeping the barrier she'd built between them. She couldn't allow that closeness to affect her objectivity. But the truth was, It already was. When she entered Edward's room that morning, she found him awake, staring at the ceiling as if lost in deep thoughts. He slowly turned his face toward her, and for a moment, the silence lingered. "Did you sleep?" "Better?" Sofia asked, maintaining her professional posture. Edward hesitated before responding. "Better than before. You helped me more than you know." His voice carried something deeper than simple gratitude. Sofia averted her gaze and picked up the equipment to begin the session. She moved closer to the bed and started adjusting him for the exercises. But as she touched his arm, she felt the warmth of his skin under her fingers, and an electric wave coursed through her body. She subtly pulled back, but Edward noticed. "Are you avoiding me?" he asked bluntly. Sofia took a deep breath, trying to maintain control. "I'm not. I'm just focused on my work." Edward tilted his head, studying her. "I see how you react, Sofia. I know you feel something, just like I do." She froze. Her heart raced, but her mind screamed at her to keep her composure. "This can't happen, Edward. It shouldn't happen." Her voice was firm, but it carried an almost imperceptible tremor. He smiled to himself, but it wasn't a smug smile. It was a smile from someone who had finally seen the truth. Maybe it's already happening. Sofia pressed her lips together and turned away. He couldn't be right. She couldn't allow him to be right. Her work, her ethics, her own history with him. All of that stopped her from even considering the possibility. But then, why was her heart beating so erratically? The session proceeded, in silence, but the tension in the air was palpable. Every touch, every prolonged glance, every held-back sigh made the atmosphere heavier. When Sofia finished the exercises, she stepped back quickly, gathering her materials with slightly trembling hands. Before leaving, she turned to him. "I'll prepare your medication." Edward just watched her, his intense gaze piercing her. "Sofia." He called her before she could leave. She stopped but didn't turn around. "Thank you." His voice was sincere, disarmed. Sofia closed her eyes for a brief moment before leaving the room. The problem wasn't Edward. The problem was that, despite everything, she didn't want him to be wrong. She crossed the hallway, her heart pounding. She took several deep breaths, trying to regain control of her emotions. How had she ended up here? How had this situation spiraled out of control so quickly? She felt suffocated by the confusion of emotions, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to do. Later, when she returned to the room to deliver the medication, she found Edward looking out the window. It was rare to see him so pensive. He didn't immediately notice her presence, and that made her hesitate. "Here's your medicine," she said, keeping her voice neutral. He slowly turned and took the glass of water and the pills. He swallowed them in silence, but his eyes never left hers. "Have you thought about what comes next?" he asked. "Next after what?" Sofia furrowed her brow. "After all of this, after I'm better, you'll leave and never want to see me again, right?" She blinked several times, surprised by the direct question. The answer should have been obvious. She should have said a simple yes and ended the conversation right then, but her mouth stayed shut. "I haven't thought about it yet," she admitted, her voice a mere whisper. Edward nodded slowly. "I think about it all the time." Sofia felt a tightness in her chest. She needed to leave before she said something she couldn't take back. "I need to attend to another patient. Rest a little." She turned to leave but stopped when she heard his voice again. "I don't want you to go." The confession escaped him before he could hold it back. She closed her eyes, feeling each of his words like a storm inside her. She couldn't respond. She couldn't even think about it. She left the room before. Her emotions betrayed her. But deep down, she knew they had been betraying her for a long time. The tension between Sofia and Edward was reaching a breaking point. Would they be able to ignore what they felt? Sofia spent the rest of the day trying to avoid her own thoughts. But it was impossible. Every step down the hallway, every glance at the door to Edward's room, every moment of silence brought back what he had said. "I don't want you to go." Those were dangerous words, full of implications she couldn't allow herself to explore. Still, they echoed in her mind like a poorly kept secret. On the other side of the door, Edward also couldn't escape the confusion that had settled inside him. Ever since Sofia had entered his life, everything had seemed different. Before, he drowned in bitterness and self-pity, but now she was a ray of light in the middle of the darkness. He didn't want to admit it, but he was no longer the same man he once was. When Sofia entered the room for another therapy session, she tried to ignore his piercing gaze. She took a deep breath and maintained her professional posture. "How are you feeling today?" she asked as she prepared the equipment. Edward took a few seconds to respond. "It depends. Do you want the polite answer or the truth?" She paused for a moment, unsure if she wanted to hear what he really thought. But she kept her composure. "The truth," she said, her voice firm, although her heart was beating faster. He tilted his head, his eyes locking with hers. "I'm tired of pretending that nothing is happening here." Sofia felt her stomach churn. She needed to get out of this conversation before she lost control. "Let's start the exercises," she said, looking away and approaching him. She helped Edward sit up on the bed and began working on the movements of his legs. But the closeness made everything even more difficult. Every touch, every eye contact carried an intensity that made her nervous. Edward noticed, and couldn't help but give a subtle smile. "This happens with you too, doesn't it?" he whispered, his voice low, almost like a secret. Sofia swallowed hard. She felt the heat rise up her neck, but refused to admit the obvious. She quickly finished the exercise and stepped back. "Finish resting, I'll be back later." And she hurried out, not giving him time to insist. But Edward didn't need words to understand. Her eyes had already said everything. Sofia walked down the hallway trying to control her breathing. She felt like a stretched rope, about to snap. When she finally reached the kitchen, she leaned against the sink and closed her eyes. She couldn't let this happen. Not after everything he'd done in the past. Not after all the effort to remain professional, but her heart stubbornly disagreed. "Sofia?" The soft voice of the housekeeper made her open her eyes. "Are you okay? You look pale," the gray-haired lady asked. Sofia forced a smile. "I'm just a little tired," she lied. The housekeeper studied her for a moment before smiling in understanding. "Has Mr. Edward been giving you trouble?" she asked in a playful tone. Sofia sighed. "He has changed," she confessed without thinking too much. The lady raised her eyebrows. "Changes can be good, my dear. Sometimes we just need to open our eyes to see things in a new way." Sofia remained silent. Was she being unfair by holding Edward captive to the image of the arrogant man she had known years ago? Had he really changed? That evening, when she returned to his room to deliver the last medication of the day, she found him sitting, looking out the window. "You're always so thoughtful," she commented, trying to steer away from her own thoughts. Edward turned toward her with a faint smile. "It's hard not to be, especially when there's so much new happening." Sofia tried to ignore the message behind his words. She handed him the pills and watched as he took them. But before she could leave, he surprised her. "If I could go back in time, I would do everything differently," he murmured suddenly. She furrowed her brow, not immediately understanding. "What do you mean?" Edward looked at her seriously. "If I knew one day I would need you, that you'd be the only person capable of making me see beyond my own ego, I would have been a different man with you from the beginning." Sofia's heart skipped a beat. "Don't say that," she whispered. "But it's the truth," he insisted. And I know deep down, you feel it too." She couldn't respond. Everything inside her screamed that she needed to leave before she gave in to something she couldn't undo. But as she turned to leave, she felt a warm hand gently holding hers. The touch was enough to make her stop. "You don't have to be afraid, Sofia," Edward murmured. Her eyes met his. There was something there, something deep, true, something no logical justification could erase. And it was in that moment that she realized that running away might no longer be an option. Now that emotions were becoming more evident, how much longer could Sofia avoid the truth? Sofia felt like she was in a maze with no way out. Every passing day made it harder to ignore the truth. The problem was that truth came with an immense weight, the weight of the choices she had made up until now, the weight of the past that insisted on reminding her who Edward was, or who he had been. That morning, as she organized the physical therapy materials, her thoughts were distant. She didn't notice when Edward was watching her from the bed, his expression serious, almost melancholic. He didn't like the distance between them, not now that he was certain of what he felt. "You're running away from me, Sofia." His voice cut through the silence of the room. She stopped, but didn't turn to face him. "I'm not running away, Edward." Her voice was low, but heavy with restrained emotion. "Then look at me and say it," he challenged. Sofia closed her eyes for a moment before turning around. His gaze pinned her in place. Those eyes, once cold and arrogant, were now filled with something new, something that scared her because it made her want to believe. "I can't get involved with you," she said finally. "Why? Because I was an idiot in the past? Because I humiliated you when I didn't know what really mattered in life? I regret that every day. But what I feel now is real." Sofia took a deep breath. She wanted to believe. She wanted it so badly it almost hurt. But there was something greater than that. "Edward, I'm your nurse. I'm here to take care of you, to ensure you recover. I can't cross that line." "But what about when I'm healed?" He leaned forward slightly. "Will you keep pretending nothing happened?" She didn't have an answer for that. So she turned and left the room, leaving Edward alone with his own doubts. The tension between them remained throughout the week. Sofia avoided spending unnecessary time in his room, and Edward, though he tried, couldn't pull her into a longer conversation. But he was determined. If he couldn't reach her with words, he would try with actions. In the late afternoon, when Sofia entered to administer the medication, she found the bed empty. Panic surged through her. "Edward!" she called, looking around. Then she heard a noise coming from the balcony. Her heart raced when she saw him standing, leaning on his cane, gazing into the horizon. "You can't get up by yourself yet," she exclaimed, rushing to him. Edward gave a sideways smile. "It's about time I start trying, don't you think?" Sofia took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. But it wasn't just concern she felt. It was pride. Seeing him there, after everything he had been through, was proof of his strength, and also of how he had changed. He looked at her, as if he could hear her thoughts. "I want to be a better man, Sofia. For myself. For you. For us." The silence between them was only broken by the soft night breeze. Sofia felt her heart in conflict with her mind. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop fighting. Now that Edward was determined to prove his love, would Sofia finally let the barriers fall? The tension between Sofia and Edward reached its peak. Would she finally allow her feelings to speak louder? Sofia felt the weight of the moment in every fiber of her body. Edward's words still echoed in her mind. "I want to be a better man. For myself, for you, for us." Was that really what he wanted? Did people really change? Could she trust him? That night, Sofia barely slept. She tossed and turned in bed, trying to make sense of her own feelings. Part of her still clung to fear, to the resistance of getting involved with someone who, in the past, had made her feel so insignificant. But there was another part of her that longed to believe, to give a chance to what was growing between them. The next morning, when she entered Edward's room, he was already awake. Sitting on the bed, staring out the window, he looked lost, in thought. "Good morning," she said, trying to sound natural. He turned his face toward her, a subtle smile on his lips. "Good morning, Sofia." She approached to begin the physical therapy, but the silence between them was different. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with something unspoken, something on the verge of overflowing. Edward watched her as she prepared the equipment. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, the inner conflict. He wanted to give Sofia the time she needed, but he also knew that some truths had to be said. "I know I'm asking a lot. I know I don't deserve your trust so easily," he began. "But I want to earn it, Sofia. I want to show you that I can be a different man." She took a deep breath without looking at him. "I just need time. Edward, it's not easy to just forget everything that's happened. I don't want you to forget. I want you to see that I'm someone better now, and that this—" He hesitated before continuing. "This thing that's happening between us is real." Sofia closed her eyes for a moment. She wanted to believe. She wanted it so badly it almost hurt. The day passed in a blur. She tried to keep herself busy, avoiding thinking about what she was feeling. But that night, while walking through the mansion's garden to clear her mind, she heard footsteps behind her. "Can't sleep?" Edward's voice was soft. She turned to him, surprised to see him there. He was leaning on his cane, but walking with more steadiness than before. "I needed some air," she replied. He approached and stood by her side. "I did too. Sometimes the fresh air helps organize thoughts." She laughed quietly. "And do you have a lot to organize?" Edward looked at her with intensity. "Just one, actually." Sofia's heart skipped a beat. The silence that followed was so charged that she felt like she could touch it. Then, on an impulse she didn't fully understand, she looked at him and whispered, "And what's that thought?" He didn't answer with words. He simply stepped closer, slowly, as if waiting for her to pull away. But she didn't pull back. And when their lips finally met, Sofia knew there was no turning back. The kiss was gentle, full of hesitation and discovery. But at the same time, it was filled with everything that had been held back for so long. When they pulled away, she still felt her heart racing, her breath shallow. "This is crazy," she murmured, but didn't pull away. Edward gave a slight smile. "Maybe it is. But sometimes, craziness is the only thing that makes sense." Sofia looked at him, and for the first time allowed herself to see the man. He was now not the man he had been in the past. And in that moment, she knew she was willing to give it a chance. But before she could respond, a thunderclap echoed through the sky, making her shudder. A light rain began to fall, intensifying the moment even more. Edward held her hand. "Come, let's go inside." She hesitated for a second, but then smiled and allowed herself to be led. They ran together into the house, laughing as if they were two teenagers, feeling lighter than they had in a long time. Inside the mansion, Edward stopped at the entrance and looked at Sofia, who was trying to dry her wet hair. His gaze was filled with something new, something she hadn't seen in him before. Tenderness. "Thank you for trusting me, even if it's just a little," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. She gave a slight smile. "I'm still learning how to do that, but I think it's worth trying." Edward gently cupped her face and kissed her again, this time without hesitation, without fear. It was a long kiss, full of silent promises. Sofia felt that, finally, the barriers were coming down. Maybe it was madness, maybe it was risky. But for the first time in a long time, she was willing to take the risk. Love can transform even the Hardest of hearts, thank you for following this journey. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like and a comment.